Good morning. Thank you for your time today. As always, we are grateful to be able to connect with you all, and I'm happy to see so many familiar names in the chat. For those who don't know me, I am Bruce Anthony, and I'm one of the trainers with CERVIS Technologies. Before we jump right in, I want to make sure you know that I have several colleagues on the call today who will be able to answer your questions via the chat function. So please feel free to ask away throughout the webinar. They'll answer your questions directly, and they'll also pass along questions to me that they think will be helpful for the entire group. I also want to note that if you have to leave early before you receive a response, our customer support team will reach out to you after the webinar. And one final note before we begin, hopefully you're aware, but we do have all of these webinars recorded and available on our YouTube tutorial channel, which you can access by going to video.servicetech.com. We also have on that channel shorter form tutorials on specific topics and even some designed for volunteers. All right, let's dig into it. So the plan for today is to give you all the information you need to utilize checklists within CERVIS. So we'll talk about defining checklists themselves, kind of what makes them unique, what makes a piece of information a good candidate for utilizing checklist items. We'll also look at setting up new checklist items and managing them on volunteer profiles. And then we'll talk about covering, restrictions on your events using checklist items. And the last thing we'll go through is running searches and reports based on these checklist items. So first thing, it's important to start off by defining terms. So that's always kind of an important place to start. And there's a number of ways to track information about volunteers in service, but what makes checklist items unique is that they are also associated with dates. So they allow you to keep track of not just whether or not something was completed, but also, when it was completed, when it was due, when it will expire, and then any additional notes associated with it. And you can even link awards to checklist items as well. So checklist items are found under attribute management in the checklist item inventory management section. So you have to be an administrator to view and update this information, or an unrestricted leadership team member. When you click into this menu, this is where you create checklist items. This is not where you manage the data being captured by checklist items. So this is essentially the place where you generate new checklist items to keep track of. But where you actually engage that information is on volunteer profiles, and we'll go there in a minute. But I want to talk about a couple examples. So I have a few examples set up in my system currently. One really clear example of a good type of piece of information that checklist items can track is something like an orientation or training. If you have sort of an onboarding process that requires volunteers to complete a certain amount of trainings or orientations or certifications, or you want to keep track of, all of those types of items and when they were completed, or potentially even when they're going to expire. That's a good candidate for tracking in checklist items because you can keep track of all those dates, and the system can automatically flip things over to expired, once they've run out. So in my example here, I have this annual safety training, which I have set to expire, every 12 months, basically. When I add this to somebody's profile as completed, I mark that it will expire in 12 months. Again, we'll kind of get into how to edit that data later, but that's kind of the title of this particular item. I have a few other items in here too, like some documentation that volunteers have to return to me, this intake form, whether or not they've completed a TB test or a flu check. That's a pretty common type of checklist item to keep track of. Other things that I've seen in here pretty frequently is whether or not you have certain, again, documentation on file. So like, for example, a driver's license ID, or whether someone's a certified driver in the first place. So again, going back to that kind of like completing training. And then something else you can use checklist items to do is just to keep track of sort of internal tasks. Maybe you have an onboarding process that's pretty involved. People first fill out an application, you review their application, contact their references. After that, schedule an interview. After that, they attend an orientation. All those sorts of things. You can keep track of those as separate checklist items, and then very easily on a volunteer's profile, view which of those items have been completed, which things are still outstanding, and any of the dates associated with those. Something really important to note about checklist items too, and I kind of alluded to this at the beginning, is that you can use these as restrictions on your events. So for example, I have this safety training. If everyone has to do this every year, Well, I can use that as a restriction on the events. So when a volunteer signs up for an event, if this has expired on their profile, they wouldn't be allowed to register for that event. All right, so let's talk about building out checklist items, how that's kind of constructed. The first thing here is the checklist item name. This is going to be like the friendly name of that checklist item. Volunteers can potentially see this information, but primarily, obviously, these are kind of designed more on the back end. So that would be, obviously whatever the name of the item itself is. The description section, again, could possibly be visible to volunteers, but not necessarily. You can create checklist items using the type here that are private, meaning volunteers can never engage this information, so they wouldn't even see the description either. In that case, they wouldn't see the name or description. So the description isn't required. You can see I've left it off for some of mine. But obviously, if you want to provide more information about what a checklist item is or how someone can engage this information, that's where you can kind of expound on that. Below that, we have this auto-assign value. This can be set to yes or no. If this is set to yes, any person who creates a profile will have this checklist item assigned to them, meaning that they'll have a due date based on what value you put in here. So let's say you need everyone to complete that safety training or an intake form. Well, if you set the auto-assign value to yes, when a volunteer creates a profile, this checklist item will be assigned to them with a due date reflecting X number of days past, the date of their account creation. So if someone made an account today and I have this set to 14 days as the due date, then it would be, considered due in 2 Wednesdays, right? So that's what this auto-assign value does. If you have a checklist item that you don't need everyone to do, that you only assign in certain circumstances, or maybe people who are pursuing particular volunteer opportunities, you should leave this as no. And then essentially you'll just mark that on the individuals where it is required or where you would like that information. Now, just to reiterate with this checklist item type, there's 2 options here, private or public. Volunteers can never make changes to a checklist item on their profile. The information is only visible on the back end. But the private or public determines whether or not volunteers can see their status on their profile. If you make a checklist item public, then when a volunteer is logged into their account, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to the profile icon and then go into view as volunteer access level. As an administrator, you can always view the system as a volunteer. So if you want to test things out, this is a really nice way to do that. Now it's obviously the logged in perspective, but if we scroll down here under profile management, I can view my checklists and that would show me where I stand. So if something is overdue or expired or due, I can see the status of it here. I can see the item, I can see the due date, and then also potentially the date completed if I have completed that item. So you can see kind of all of that information is reflected here for public checklist items. But again, I cannot make changes to this from the volunteer perspective. Okay, switching back to the admin view here. That is, again, the checklist item type, either private or public. So in my system, I have 2 of those listed publicly. One is private, so that one never shows up on volunteer profiles. The due date we kind of already talked about. This is really handy in conjunction with automatically assigning checklist items just to keep track of like timelines essentially. So someone creates a profile. I want them to have done this within 2 weeks. If not, I want to email those people. Well, you can search by checklist items that are overdue. So that's kind of basically just creating another searchable mechanic for you. And then the linked award is the last item here. If you want, you can set up a checklist item so that a volunteer receives an award after you mark that checklist item as complete. So this award obviously has to exist already. We did recently have a webinar on awards as well, so you're happy to go back and review that. But basically, you can create a manually assigned award, give it a title, and any of your manually assigned awards will show up as an option when you're creating checklist items. So if we go back in here and I go to link an award, these are all manual awards. You can see that obviously in the parenthetical here as well. All right, but that's really it in terms of creating a checklist item, how to add in this information. And once you've done that, that's going to generate the item below. Now, just like basically everything in Service, this is malleable. So if you need to, after the fact, edit this information, maybe you set it up initially as auto-assign, but you don't like that anymore, you want to change the due date or change the name or the description, you can always do that. Select the checklist item, click on Update, and then make changes in here. Now, if I were to drastically change what this checklist item is tracking, I wouldn't necessarily just want to update this existing item because volunteers might have statuses already associated with this, right? So if you had kind of like a certain format that you used previously and you're switching gears, well, what you can do instead is basically just like make this a private checklist item. You could potentially remove it if you don't need to track it any further, but I would just create a new one, if it's a drastically different thing. Now, of course, if I'm just correcting a typo, changing the name of it or something like that, that's more cosmetic, then that's totally fine. But if you're drastically changing what you're tracking, you might want to just make a new checklist item instead. There's no cap to how many checklist items can be in here. And again, if you make it private, it's not going to show up on the volunteer side at all. Okay, so this is creating checklist items. The next thing we're going to talk about is engaging this information on a volunteer's profile. So where we'll be doing this is in the volunteer database. So from the main dashboard, if we go into Search Manage Volunteer Database under the Volunteer Management heading, then we can see our volunteers. If I just want to view everyone in the system, leave this blank, click Search Volunteer Database. And you can see because in my system I have some checklist items created, there's an icon next to every person's name to manage checklists. This icon does not show up if you do not already have checklists in your system. So if you're not seeing it, that's why. But you can still get to this same menu if you go into Manage a Volunteer's Profile. And then in this kind of second section or third section, you can view or update checklists. You can see it has the same icon. And if I click into this here, we can see the results on all these checklist items. And of course, I can make changes in here. So if something is overdue or complete or not assigned, of course, I can change the status. You can reassign something. You can remove it from someone's profile if it's already completed. You can assign something or just straight mark something as completed. Maybe with like the TB test, I just tell people to come in, and then once they've completed it, I just switch it over to completed. By default, it will mark today's date as the date completed. So if I were to just select that and then update, it would just mark today's date as the date completed, but I can backlog that. Maybe this person came in last Thursday. You can also add the expirations. So if I want this to expire in 1 year, I can just go and add the expiration for that. And of course, this can reflect whatever time frame you need to. And then lastly, I can also add notes. So if I wanted to have some more information about, what type of test this was or whatever it is, I can add notes in there as well. You can do bulk updates to checklist items as well. So there's these checklists on the right-hand side where you can select which items you want to perform a bulk update on. And then there's a menu to open up and basically just update in bulk multiple different items. So you could go in and change all the statuses or due dates or dates completed. All of those different items can be modified. There's a bulk update option for each of those. And then of course, when you're done, click on Update Volunteer Checklists to certify or save those changes. So that's engaging the information on an individual basis, but you can also do this for multiple volunteers at the same time. So any way that you can run a search can be used to produce an update to checklist items. So if I needed to update everybody in my database, let's say we're redoing our training and we need everyone to redo it. Well, again, I could search for everyone in the database, select them all, go into my bulk actions menu, select to update selected volunteers. When you go into bulk updating volunteers, you need to pick what you are bulk updating. And so one of the things in here is checklist items. So I can select that. Down at the bottom, click on select items to bulk update. And then let's say we're, again, redoing our safety training. So I want to mark this as assigned for every person. The due date I can leave as the default. That'll just get marked automatically based on today's date and what I set this as initially. I don't want a completion date, obviously, nor do I want an expiration date. So if I go and change that here, I can update that for all the accounts in the system at one time. It's going to ask me to confirm you're updating this for 245 profiles. These are the changes you're making. I can either proceed or cancel. So again, you can do this for your whole database or based on any search that you might run. So maybe I do this bulk update and now I go into the opportunity database and I search for all the individuals that just completed that training, right? So we have an orientation event in our system. I could select all the individuals who attended this event. There's a couple ways to do this. I could also choose multiple events. What I'm going to do here is go into view the registered volunteers, select this list, and then from here, I can click to manage the selected volunteers. So this is one way to do that. You can also do that using the bulk actions. But essentially that just searches for those individuals, and then I can take my same actions to perform a bulk update. And I could go and update all of these volunteers basically to, I have to select them first, to make those changes, right? To mark off that all these people have completed this checklist item. And that would be using the same exact steps that we previously just used. Okay, so again, we just walked through either individually updating this information for a volunteer or updating that in bulk, by selecting or running searches for sets of individuals. All right, so moving over to kind of a different part of the system. Once you have established a checklist item, you can use it as a restriction on your events. So when you create an opportunity in Service, no matter what type it is, normal event, time slot event, or service project, you can set a restriction using checklist items. Now, to reiterate, the way restrictions work in Service is that you select who is permitted to register. You don't choose who's prevented from registering. So if I want to use one of my checklist items, let's say the safety training, and use that to prohibit registration for people who haven't completed it, well, the way I would do that is select that I want people who have completed this orientation or this training to be allowed to register. So that's what I would choose through here. I select that checklist item. That means any person who has this marked as completed on their profile would be allowed to register for this event. So it's as simple as that. You can, of course, select multiple checklist items if there are multiple kind of layers of restrictions. If I need all three of these things to have been completed, then you can change this dialog to require all of the selected checklist items. And then someone would have to have all three of these items completed on their profile, not just one of them. Alternatively, maybe I only need one of these three done. They're all kind of equivalent ideas, just different paths. You could leave that as any. That's what the default is. All right, so that's setting restrictions. The last thing that I want to walk through is running searches by and creating reports using checklist items. So pretty much all of this is done through the volunteer side of the system. If we go into the advanced volunteer search, we can run a search by a checklist item. So I can expand the volunteer checklist options menu. And in here, I can select a particular checklist item. So let's say I want to view people who have completed, the intake form. I could search for a particular checklist item. I could search by the status. So if it's due, completed, overdue, expired, or not assigned. And then you can add date ranges as well. So if you only want to capture information from a particular date range, maybe I want to find people who are coming up due on the safety training, right? So they completed it last year, maybe in March or April, right? So I could run a search for people who aren't yet marked as expired, they're still completed, but kind of get ahead of the curve there. I could run a search by that kind of information through here as well. So this is searching obviously the status, potentially in conjunction with, a date range. Similarly, you can do that type of search below. You can find volunteers whose checklist item was completed or the completed date is greater than a certain number of months old. So this is that same sort of concept as what I just mentioned. I could go in here and say, I want to find people whose annual safety training is over 6 months old. So within the next 6 months, they have to redo this, right? So same kind of concept, but basically just allowing you to select particular months, finding people who are, have something that's completed a certain number of years ago or different items like that. So that's kind of searching in conjunction with checklist items. Now, one thing I want to point out, any search that you run in Service is something that you can then search within. Recently, we added an option. So let's say we run a search here. If you go into the advanced search again, at the bottom, there's the advanced options here, and you can select to combine the results of what you just ran with a new search. So effectively what this allows you to do is search within a search. So kind of refilter or refine the search that you just ran to look for a set of individuals from within that. This is particularly useful for things like checklist items. Maybe you want to find someone who has completed a certain number of checklist items, all of a different set of items or things like that. Right now you can only select one checklist item at a time to run that search, but then you can search within that. So I could find people who have completed a certain item, and then I could, run that search, basically select to include my previous results here, and then it would kind of run within that. All right, so that's kind of running searches based on that information. Now, once you've run a search for individuals in Service, obviously there's a number of different things that you can do. You can send emails, you can send text messages, you can export information, you can run reports. I want to point out a couple of those items. Obviously, if I need to, engage these people, maybe I search for people who have a checklist item coming up due or is overdue. Then I could select these people and send them an email. In those cases, I would recommend that you have a template email that you use, so you can save and load templates in Service. So just load that template up, and that way you can just kind of create sort of a workflow that makes it really simple to re-engage that information. Particularly if it's something you're going to be doing frequently, you don't necessarily want to have to, rewrite that every time. So saving templates is really valuable. Alongside that, also saving searches. So if you're frequently running a search for people who are, overdue on a certain checklist item, well, you could actually save a search using that information. Just kind of as a quick aside with that, if you are kind of, notifying volunteers, hey, you're overdue on this item, well, sometimes that's going to be an individual who's disengaged with you, right? So in those cases, I typically recommend utilizing another kind of type of search in conjunction with that. Specifically, I would use the active versus inactive volunteers, or some other means of identifying people that are completely disengaged. So active, inactive is something you set on volunteer profiles, but you could also search for individuals based on not having had any account activity for more than X number of months. So maybe you consider, if someone hasn't done anything in 12 months, they're kind of inactive, right? You could use this search in conjunction with a checklist item, right? Like annual safety training is due or overdue or expired, right? Maybe I run that search. So that way I can save that search and rerun that, once a month or every 3 months or however I want to do that. And then identify the individuals who are still active with me, but have expired, on that checklist item. That way I'm not necessarily emailing people all the time who are no longer working with me. Okay, 2 other kind of reports that I want to just point out. Once you've run a search for a set of individuals, of course, you can export volunteer information. So there is a spreadsheet download in the volunteer database. This does not include checklist information. It just includes other volunteer profile information. So if you just need info about the volunteers, contact info, things like that, this is a quick and easy way to do that. If you do want to include checklist information, whether or not something is completed, when it was completed, expiration dates, all of that kind of stuff, then the way you would do that is via the report management section. So go into report management under the volunteer management heading. And down towards the bottom, checklist status report allows you to print out a spreadsheet including any of the checklists that you select. This also importantly allows you to use queries. So if you want to run a search for a set of individuals first, and then use that previous search as the query, only those volunteers will show up in this report. And then you can also select to include more or less account information if you want to. So if you want their contact information right alongside that, or age info or things like that, you can select to include as much volunteer profile info as you want to alongside each of the checklists that you select. Now, each of these checklist items adds multiple columns to the report. So if we run this real quick, this will show us basically all the volunteer information that we selected. So name, phone, email, and then I chose birth date and age. And then each checklist item has its title, the status for the individual, the due date, the date completed, the expiration date, and then any notes, right? So I kind of just reset this actually for everyone, which is why they're all the same. But basically, yeah, it includes all of these columns for each checklist item that you include in that report. And then, of course, this is a plain spreadsheet. You can sort by any of these columns, and it just allows you to have all that information in one place. All right. So to round it all out, today we defined checklist items in service. We took a look at a few examples and talked about what type of data is a good candidate for utilizing checklist items. We also engaged the different parts of the system where checklist items are referenced or utilized, including setting restrictions on events. And then we explored running reports based on checklist items, or even just simply exporting the information from the checklist items themselves. So our team has been answering questions throughout the call. And of course, if you do have further questions, you can always engage our customer support team. I think all the questions that they got were pretty specific, so we're not going to take any of those for the larger group. If you do have more questions, of course, feel free to continue writing those in as we're rounding this out here. But otherwise, you can always use our customer support team. Whenever you're logged in, click on the Need Help option. From there, you can type in a topic. So let's say you want to learn more about checklist items. Right? We have a lot of resources in here. We do keep this up to date. So if you like to learn this way, there's a lot of data in there. But also, no matter what you search by, you can always click on Contact Us and submit a question through here. So other than that, I did want to reiterate too, the YouTube channel and the resources on there. Again, all of our recorded webinars go up there. If you go to video.servicetech.com, you can also go to YouTube and search for Service Technologies. But that video.servicetech.com just takes you straight there. All right, so once again, I just want to thank you for your time. It's a pleasure to be able to engage in this form of large format. We're grateful for your passion for serving your communities well, and we're excited to be a part of that with you and help you spend your time efficiently and effectively. So as always, if you have questions about the topic we covered today, again, you feel free to connect with our customer support team using that Need Help button. And I, again, just want to reiterate, we do have a lot of recorded material available for you on that YouTube channel. Otherwise, thank you so much again for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.